When I talk about altering policy agendas, I mean altering how people think about and understand the issues that are at stake that you're working on. Thinking about what are the potential coalitions of people that you could bring together to help energize and sustain this work, even when it might face critics or it might kind of face some rocky times. Helping other people to also understand and then potentially alter how previous policy commitments have been understood, right? There's a lot of legend and lore about what policies mean and what they're supposed to be doing, but you have a chance to adjust that with the work that you're engaging in. For example, if you look at the chart on the slide, what I have there is a pretty common plot that many of you have seen. You've seen things like this from other states. It's a common fact that we know students who come from families in poverty tend to do worse on standardized tests than students who do not. And this is just an example from some NAEP data looking at the trend over the last decade or so. That's a commonly understood fact. The question is, how do you get people to understand that fact through the lens of the work that you're doing, right? To say that students from families in poverty do worse than students who are not from homes in poverty doesn't really suggest anything about why that's the case or what we might do about it, what the logical next steps might be, what are the interests involved that conspire, not in a sinister way, but that come together to create that result. There are lots of different ways we might understand the plot that I have on the board here, and what I'm suggesting is that one of the things you need to do is to help people understand this through the lens of principles and leadership and state policy, what states can do about this from the perspective of the principal. Okay? So this is hard work, right? You're trying to get people to change how they fundamentally understand the world. It's very difficult work, but perhaps it's as important or even more important than the technical work that you're doing. So now for some bad news. I'll end on good news, though. Now for some bad news. There are some challenges that you all face in shaping this agenda, and this adds to the challenge of just trying to get people to see the world in a different way. I'm going to offer 3 challenges. One is that there are capacity problems that exist. This table that I have on the board here gives you a description of, it's some research from my friends out at the University of Washington, the Center for Reinventing Public Education. They show us that if you look at state agencies, most of the time state agencies don't have a lot of people to do very difficult work, right? So you see the ratio of schools in the various states here compared to the number of school improvement staff that work in the SEA. So in Colorado, you know, the ratio of more than 300 schools to 1 person trying to be in charge or try to help manage school improvement. This is a huge, huge challenge. We all know that state education agencies have been gutted during the last 2 decades, right? The responsibilities have gotten greater, the work has gotten harder, but the resources have been clawed back, right? Think for a moment, how many politicians do you know who have won votes from the public or in their legislative chambers who have gained those votes because they've promised to invest resources to help state education agencies do their work, right? Crickets, right? Conversely, right, how many politicians do you hear who talk about how we need to cut the bureaucracy, right? There's bureaucratic fat. There are nameless, faceless bureaucrats that are really the bane of our existence. And really, if we could just kind of get our arms around that, let people solve problems, things would be great, right? Well, the fact of the matter is, politicians, I think, narrow-mindedly think about dollars wasted if they're not actually in school buildings. But people in school buildings know if the systems that support them are crummy, then it doesn't really matter how much money they have. It's going to be really hard to do a great job, right? So this is one of the challenges in terms of capacity. We also know that because there often is low capacity, what do we end up getting? We get policy that just basically descends into a big compliance exercise. People kind of pretend that they're really implementing innovative things, that they're leaving no child behind, or that they're making sure every student succeeds. But in actuality, we're basically checking boxes because that's the best we can do, given the challenges that confront us and the resources that we have at our disposal. So that's one challenge. Remember, I did say I'm going to get to good news at the end. So hey, so just stick with me. Second challenge is that Schools of education often have bad reputations in the education space and also outside of the education space in our general sort of political realm. The two quotes I have on the board here come from a series of reports that Levine did, Art Levine did on schools of education. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen these reports. It's the Education Schools Project is what it's called. So what you have, I think, here is a classic example of bad apples spoiling the barrel, right? There are some great schools of education. There are people doing excellent work. Those people are in this room today. But you also know, if you are honest with yourselves, that there are a lot of bad schools of education. There are many that probably shouldn't exist. And so the reputational effect of that on the entire field is huge, right? It often becomes hard for schools of education to command the kind of respect that they need to command as they're doing important work like preparing principals. When, sort of in a strange twist, when there is a sort of reputational sort of value seen in schools of education, often it's seen for the wrong reasons, right? A lot of teachers get master's degrees and pay full freight without fellowships or financial aid. And so schools of education sometimes are seen as a cash cow in the larger political economy of the university. So we have to move a lot of people through these programs so we get them paying tuition so that we can fund other things that we really want to do, right? We also know that they employ people in local communities, and state legislators are loath to take aim at what often are major employers in communities around their states. And so part of this problem then is reputational. You all, the School of Ed representatives here, have a hugely important role to play. And to get that seat at the table, to have that seat that alters the way people understand things in this realm of principal preparation, we need to work on, and we need to think about what might help improve that reputational problem. So that's the second thing. Third thing is a challenge about the narratives that seem to dominate the field, right? So one of the things, if you've paid any attention in the last 20 years or more, what you know is that narratives about teachers and the role of teachers tend to dominate these discussions, right? Teachers are seen as foundational for the success of children, and in many ways they are. The cover that you have on the left there is a famous report that many of you saw when it came out in the late 90s from the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, right? Doing what matters most, investing in teachers. President Obama sort of echoes this claim 20 years later when he talks about the most important thing that is going to change the outcome of a kid in school is that the kid has a great teacher in front of the classroom. And often principals just are dropped from this narrative. So there are lots of reasons why that is the case, I think, and the Wallace Report that Jody alluded to and Matt alluded to get into some of these reasons. But an important implication is the frames that people use to understand the problems that confront schools, those often don't include principals, right? Or if they do, their principals are included more or less as people that run good professional development for teachers and not about what the principals themselves actually need to do great work as the principal. And so this is another thing that we need to kind of think about. This is a challenge, right? Changing the narrative, changing the way people understand these things. So now we'll get to some of the good news, right? These are big challenges, but I do think there is no reason to despair. There are some factors working in your favor right now, and there, I think, is some wind in your sails, right? First of all, the rollout of ESSA, for all of its kind of diversions and kind of curves it's taken, it does provide a window of opportunity, right? People are saying this is a moment where we can kind of rethink what we've learned from the last decade or more, where we can kind of rethink roles and responsibilities, and states themselves are supposed to be the ones leading this charge. So understanding the problems and understanding what are the policies that we could be mobilized to address the issue of principals. And then lastly, it's about politics, right? It's about knowing what the political forces are that are lined up to either knock down these ideas that you have or the forces that might be mobilized to help advance them, right? You all are doing political work, whether you know it or not, whether you want to do it or not. That's really part of what this is all about. Otherwise, this stuff isn't going to really go anywhere. And when the money runs out from Wallace, this stuff will kind of grind to a halt, and someone else who's able to figure out how to couple these three things of problems, policies, and politics their vision of what the state should be doing is going to be the one that, that dominates. So these are the kinds of things that I think you all should be thinking about as you move things forward. And so what I wanted to do, that's I think a very useful framework. What I wanted to do is to give you some examples of ideas that plug into that framework that fit with what you've been working on. Okay, so here's one idea of the direction you might go. One of the things I think you could say, and that would be compelling to help people understand, is that principals play distinctive, I should have put that word in all caps, distinctive and complex leadership roles in schools. So schools face multidimensional challenges, right? This is part of the problem stream, understanding the problems. They face multidimensional challenges, and policies that support principals are essential for helping schools to address those challenges. So what I think is a really important point here, and part of the narrative that I would encourage you to try to correct, is when people talk about school leadership, often they talk about it as a very kind of mushy category, right? In the sense that everybody in the school is a leader, right? We've got teacher leaders, we have parent leaders, we have department leaders. Really, school leadership is absolutely important, and this is the way we're thinking about it. You also, I'm sure, have heard the notion of distributing leadership, right, within schools, right? Successful schools are places where leadership is distributed around the building, right, to serve various objectives. And so I'm not saying that's incorrect. I think places that function well do give people opportunities to lead. But I think there's a downside to that, to discussing that category in that kind of broad way. It's that people forget that the principal actually has a particular role to play, right, as leader. The principal is not the same thing as the department leader of the English teachers in the school. The principal is not the same kind of leadership role as the sort of professional development team that exists within the school to help teachers learn how to teach math better, right? Principals have very distinctive roles, and it's hugely important to remind people about what those roles are. Now, in the Wallace Report that we did a few years ago, one of the things we looked at was a national survey of principals that comes out of something called the Schools and Staffing Survey. Some of you may have even participated as a respondent in that, or you've actually seen the data. And a question in that survey asks principals, so what are the kinds of things that you do? And you can see on the slide here, we looked at these categories, and principals reporting that they had a great deal of influence or quite a bit of influence over certain tasks in the school. And if you look, there should be something that kind of hits you between the eyes here, because a lot of the narrative, again, about principals and their leadership is that the principal's role has been transformed, right? The principal's job is not what it was 20, 30 years ago, right? This is a new era, right? And principals are now instructional leaders. They are mobilizing teachers for learning to support students as they learn challenging material and give them very engaging learning experiences. I think that's part of the story, but if that's the only part of the story, how in the world are principals giving the responses that they're giving in the top part of this, these sets of results, right? Principals still spend a lot of time on the traditional stuff, and they need support from their districts and from their states as they try to work on and do that traditional stuff. If you read into the details of ESSA, one of the things coming, right, is a lot of reporting requirements about how money is used in individual schools. And I would bet dollars to donuts that the principals are going to have a lot of work to do to help local districts, fulfill that mandate that's on the table. So if you think the traditional stuff has gone away, then I think you're really living in some other world. These kinds of things still exist, and they still bear down heavily on principals. So I think part of your work is to help people understand that, to help people grasp the multidimensional roles that principals play, and to help people understand that really there's a layering of responsibilities on principals that other school leaders don't necessarily feel, right? Those other school leaders should be supported too, but think about these distinctive things that bear on the principal and influence the work that they're able to do for their schools. So that's one important kind of piece that I think you can use to start helping people understand the problem and to help people to start understanding some of the policies that might help produce solutions. That's one thing. Second thing, great principals are multipliers of effective teaching. There's a lot of evidence that shows this. I purposefully did not put the Wallace reports on the slide just to prove to you that it's not just groupthink, right? There's people actually outside of the Wallace orbit who do research on these things and find this, reach this finding. You can look in a lot of Wallace reports to see this finding too. So what this means then, I think, is investments in principals, specifically the principal, not just the generic school leader in the building, don't have to trade off against other priorities that people might have when it comes to schools and making schools work well. So one of the things this does is it helps you to show people how policies that are relevant to principals specifically are connected to these other essential functions of schools, namely teachers, right, and teaching. Now, I think this is hugely important because it helps you to get the politics right. There are huge implications for building coalitions around your ideas, I think. We know that teachers and their unions are often heavyweights in the arena of state policy debates, right? Teachers and the people who advocate for teachers have done a masterful job of convincing people that Title II in ESSA, that Title II is really about teachers, right? Because that's where most of the money traditionally has gone. That's where most of the programs, have traditionally been focused, that things that come out of Title II. And so I know you all are excited about more attention given to principals in Title II, but one of the things you should be ready for are the fights that are about to happen about how that money should be allocated when previous understandings of it have tended to focus on teachers, right? 3+ million of them around the country. It's a pretty formidable political force. I like to remind people that if you think about it, 1 out of every 100 people in America is a public school teacher, right? That's how many teachers there are. It's a lot of people, right? Not as many principals. So everything you can do to try to help people understand that what's in the interest of principals also feeds into the interest of teachers. It's a really compelling line of argument that I think you should work on, right? Talk to the teacher folks who you know in your states and in your communities. Help them to understand that. Look, we're on the same team here, right? That's what this is really about. Because when principals can do their jobs well, we know that teachers can do their jobs a lot better too. So that's the second point. Third point, let's talk about something that state legislators like to think about, which is money and budgets. I think you could make a compelling argument that states and localities can't afford not to invest in policies regarding recruitment, training, and support of principals. It simply costs too much to do a bad job at these things, right? So the data that you see on the slide is from a report that came out a handful of years ago, and the organization that produced it was trying to say, let's put some dollars and cents on the table here to see how much does it actually cost to recruit, train, and retain excellent principals. And what they did, I thought they did this in a very smart way. They said, well, let's take sort of the lower bound kind of, what might be considered a bare bones approach to this, and let's consider an upper bound, a very generous, very robust approach to this. And what you see is the amount of dollars from the low end is around more than $35,000, and for the high end, it's an order of magnitude above that. It's around $300,000. They estimated that kind of what they considered to be typical is around $75,000. This is per principal. So if you think about it, what state or locality wants to invest almost $100,000 in training a person who's going to get bad training, who's going to then go on the job and get frustrated, who's then going to cycle out of the job, and then you got to start the game all over again, right? Folks, nobody has the money to do that. And so if we can do it well and make sure we get people this kind of excellent training, excellent support, they're going to stay in the profession. And then this is going to cascade in so many ways, right? We won't be spending this kind of money every year to just get principals to staff our buildings. If you flip back to the previous slide I had up there, it's also going to cascade because you're not going to have teachers doing the kind of rotation in and out of schools, right? We know a main reason why teachers leave is because the principal isn't doing a very good job. And so these are the kinds of things that you can, I think, you can put this in terms, like I said, that state legislators really understand. This is a dollars and cents issue, right? There's a lot of wasted money that we have because we don't support principals very well. If we did a great job, this is something that we would be able to really kind of assist not only the individual principals in the schools, the teachers, then obviously the children. This stuff all is related to children. So in thinking about this in terms of agenda setting, what does this narrative help you to do, right? It also helps you to address the political stream, but it helps you to address the political stream in a way that extends the coalition outside of education, right? The previous thing I had up here, sort of this story, is about helping you to extend your coalition within education, right? You want to get the teachers on your side. That's what this is about. This one is about how you think about people outside of education, how you bring them on board with your work. So you're going to bring state legislators on board to your work because they're going to see the dollars and cents. They're going to see that they can't afford not to help you do what you're doing. The other people you're going to bring on board with this kind of narrative is all the people in your state who are leaders in business, people who are leaders in the military. These institutions spend thousands of dollars, millions of dollars every single year recruiting, training, and supporting people so they can do their jobs well. The big point that I'm trying to make here is I think you need to think of the technical part of your work, certainly put your minds to that, but don't forget about the political side of your work too, the agenda setting side of your work. Because if this is not part of your thinking, any solution you come up with, it's going to be a flash in the pan. It'll be, you know, an initiative that kind of had some promise but never really made itself to completion and really had the kind of impact it was hoping to have. State levers for change that we talked about in the report that you all have focused on 6 main things. And I want to underscore there are other things too that state policy can do in order to try to advance teaching and learning and principals leading their schools. The report itself focused on things that are most directly relevant to principals themselves. And so this idea of setting standards, recruitment, overseeing principal preparation, licensing, principal professional development, and evaluation. And so, as you know, there are lots of potential levers then that states can pull as they attempt to take advantage of the new flexibility in ESSA. But I will say, and this is something that came out when we were doing the research for the report, this is part of your agenda setting job that I was mentioning yesterday, not all state officials are aware of all these levers, right? Not everybody who has a chance to exercise power in a good way in states actually understands how all these things work. And we also have elections coming up, so you're going to have a new crop of people coming in who maybe have never heard of these things, right? Their idea of the principal is, well, those are the people that school districts hire. What in the hell does the state have to do with any of that, right? And so the need to kind of constantly put this in front of people, re-educate people, help them understand what the state's potential action points might be is, I think, in some ways it's insulting that we have to kind of educate people about these things, but that's kind of the fact of the matter, right? And so this is something that I think you could almost keep it on a little card in your wallet and pull it out anytime you have a chance to hand it off to someone who might be able to think about these things and use them well. So there are lots of examples within the report about different states using these levers and how they might play out in practice. And one of the other interesting things that we learn is that in the report is that not all states are at the same point on all of these things, right? Ideally, every state would be great at doing all these items, but not every state is. And the fact of the matter, right, some local school districts are even ahead of their states on some of these things, right? The things that they've been able to work on through Wallace's money, using Wallace's money, their own resources, other funds. Some localities are even further along. So what I want you to think about in the room, the state level officials, and this sort of echoes a question that Bonnie Fuzzarelli asked yesterday, if you're a state level official thinking about using these levers in this new ESSA environment, how can you do it to encourage and maximize the ability of localities to actually get creative and do things well that are going to generate the kind of results that we want to see, right? If resources are scarce, one thing we want to make sure we don't do is handcuff people who have great ideas for improving the work, the ability of principals to do great jobs. So that's one thing where I think the state officials especially need to kind of think it through if you do have districts that are ahead of where you're a state agency, where the center of gravity in your state agency is. The other thing I would suggest is for the districts that are farther along, that needs to be a conversation with your state officials and with other districts, I think, in your state, right? Again, you need to be, it's a messaging, it's a communication exercise to help people understand what it is you're doing that maybe is leveraging the best out of what these levers can offer. And maybe there are small improvements that the state could make, sort of the low-hanging fruit, that would really improve how these things operate in practice. And so one of the things that I wanted to think about is the ESSA plans that states are developing are really long documents. There's a lot of stuff in there. And so as a practical matter, it might be difficult to do all of these things well, to pull all of these levers in sort of an effective way as you think about adjusting things in the new era that we're in. And so a second question I was going to ask us to think about as we get started here is to say, this might be a harder question to answer in the moment, but if you kind of take stock of where you are right now in your state, in your locality, in your work, one thing that you might want to think about is, all right, among these levers for action that we've listed here, are there some right now where we see, oh, you know what, we could get a lot of high impact if we invested some of our time in that, right? Because like I said, as a practical matter, these ESSA plans are really long, and a lot of that stuff just isn't going to get done once everything starts rolling out. And so from the point of view of these levers that we identify in the report, I think it'd be really useful for you to think through across these dimensions, what would be the things where we could act, with energy and with resources to get some high impact kinds of results, and which sort of spots in this list are things where, you know what, if we took that on, that's going to take up a lot of our time. It's going to be a big, difficult challenge, fight. It's going to be multi-year. It might not be our best use of our effort at the moment, but maybe we can plan for that as we're going forward, right? We can think of it more as a long-term effort rather than something near-term. So this is one of the things that we really tried to underscore in the Wallace Report, is when you see these 6 levers, it's not a checklist, right? It's not a 6-point plan where we say if you do all these things in sequence, then you're going to get some great results. The whole point of the report was to say these things need to be adapted to state and local contexts. And like I said, given the conditions that you see and that you're working in your states and localities, how can you use these things best to get the kind of results that you want? What I think happens too much in policy making, policy design, is people design policies and plans and they don't think about the implications for action, right? How will this plan that I've written down actually change behavior of people in the places where we want to change it, and how will it change their behavior for the better, okay? And so one example that I just wanted to kind of put up here, this is a common thing that as I was reading through some of the ESSA plans that are out there, this kind of statement here is a common idea that is embedded within a lot of ESSA plans. It might be worded this way, it might be worded slightly differently, but a common plan is to implement cycles of continuous improvement for principles based on data, okay? That's the plan. That's what we say the plan says, here's what we want, we're going to put into place. Now, I think what you need to do is ask then this follow-up question about that plan. What are the implied critical tasks for different people up and down the chain of implementation? So if you are really serious about implementing cycles of continuous improvement for principles based on data, then what does that mean state education agency people need to do, right? When they wake up and go to work and they're going to implement this part of the plan, what are they specifically doing to implement it? Similarly, what do you need local school district officials to be doing when they get up and go to work every day to implement this part of the plan? And then lastly, what are the implications for principals themselves in school? What should they be doing concretely in order to carry out this part of the plan? So now we are really in the weeds, right? We are really into the plans, the design, the key tasks, what people are literally doing at work every day. Now let's pull out a little bit and take a look at one last piece here, which is to think about your allies, your enemies, and your enemies in the environment. So if states are likely to use ESSA in ways that break from previous patterns of sort of compliance or box checking, it's going to require envisioning what the critical tasks are. And if that's true, you can be sure of two things happening, right? One thing is some people and organizations are going to love this. And the second thing, see where I'm going, right? Some people and organizations are going to hate this. And so a question to then think about, in your state, what are the conditions like? So if we took your ESSA plan, the thing that I just held up, and we said, all right, what is it that you're expecting to have happen in there? You could ask yourself, this first question, not including the organizations represented in this room, could you identify 2 organizational allies likely to be most instrumental in helping you to advance your work? Okay, so who are the likely actors out there who are poised to help you? Now, you can write that down if you want. You can just keep it in your head, save it for future discussion if you'd like. Okay, so that's one thing. The second question then is to think, keep your eyes wide open. Can you identify 2 potential organizational enemies that you anticipate will likely pose significant challenges to your ESSA work? Now, I didn't include the first part, not including organizations represented in this room. I hope that 2 of your main organizational enemies are not represented in this room. But if they are, that's a deeper conversation. I doubt you would have been able to pull your act together to apply for the Wallace Grant and actually win it if that were true. So I think we're probably safe there. But there will be other organizations out there who will be hostile or who will be very skeptical to the work and the plans that you are proposing. And so what I would suggest, and this builds on what came out in our panel discussion yesterday with Steve Tozer and Sarah Shelton, which was after you identify the likely allies and likely enemies beyond the people in this room, hold a meeting where you bring them all in the same room, okay? Get them all in the same room, right? The people that hate this stuff and the people that love this stuff. Get them all in the same room. When you do that, you are going to learn a lot, for one thing, right? And what you're going to see is you're probably going to see more areas where there's overlap than you thought, because a lot of the big fights and debates are about sort of smoke and mirrors, and it's not about tasks. It's not about what people are actually doing every single day. Last bit of information I'll share with you, then we'll cut for some discussion, is an important finding from the Wallace Report was that there might be support for sustaining your work that comes from unexpected corners in your state, okay? So one of the things we did in 2014 as part of this work is Jody and her team identified several of the Wallace, I think it was about 35 of the previous Wallace grantees, and we asked them about sustainability, not about doing the Wallace work with the Wallace money, but asking them, once the Wallace money ran out, what was it, who was it in the state that helped you to sustain the work on the initiatives that were sustained? And we gave people some choices of groups to choose from, and a high number meant that the group was very important for sustaining change, and a 1 meant it was not important at all. And so all the groups we asked about were important in some way. The state education agency was the most important, but I think one of the most fascinating results is the second bar up from the bottom. It was a random category in a way. It was people identifying other groups in the state outside of the kind of typical actors who they identified as very important for helping to sustain the work. So, and again, in doing these convenings, you're going to find some help from maybe some sources you hadn't even thought of when you began.